Mara's phone wouldn't stop vibrating on the passenger seat, lighting up the dark car with the same headline again and again. She didn't open it, not yet. Her hands were locked around the steering wheel so hard her knuckles looked pale under the dashboard glow. A cold, half-finished Starbucks sat in the cup holder, melted ice clicking softly every time her knee bounced. On the screen of the government-issued tablet balanced on her lap, a drone camera stared into a jagged hole in the desert like the earth had simply given up. The live feed shook as the drone dipped lower. And then, in the dust and quiet, something appeared down there that made Mara forget to breathe. Not lights. Not aliens. Not anything like the internet was screaming about. It was something worse, somehow. Something human. The first time Mara heard the word sinkhole, she was in a break room that smelled like burnt popcorn and lemon disinfectant. She worked at a contractor facility outside Las Vegas, the kind with badge readers and posted rules about phones and photos, the kind where people didn't ask too many questions because questions had a way of sticking to your name. It was a Tuesday, the plainest kind. Mara had a microwaved breakfast burrito in one hand and her student loan app open in the other. She was doing the math again, like maybe the numbers would change out of shame. They didn't. Her younger brother, Luis, had texted her at 6:12 a.m. from their mom's place in North Las Vegas. Mom's meds went up again. We're short this month. Mara stared at it until her eyes watered, then blinked hard like she could force the feeling back into her body. She sent back what she always sent. I'll figure it out. She didn't know how. She just couldn't handle the alternative, which was telling them she couldn't. Mara was 32, smart in a practical way, the kind that kept systems running and meetings on schedule. She had a job title that sounded better than it felt. UAS Operations Support. Drones, basically. Paperwork, compliance checks, routine flight logs, and the kind of internal training that made you feel like you were always being watched, even when nobody was watching. She hadn't planned on this life. She'd planned on finishing engineering school and doing something that mattered, something clean and clear. But her dad got sick in her last year. Then the bills came. Then the credit cards. Then her dad was gone. Then her mom stopped sleeping and started forgetting little things, like leaving the stove on, like calling Mara by her aunt's name, like wearing the same sweater 3 days in a row and insisting she hadn't. Mara moved back home for a year, then left again because leaving felt like breathing, even if it also felt like betrayal. She told herself she was doing it for them. Better job. Better pay. Stability. Stability was a word that sounded like a door that closed properly. In the break room, one of the techs had the news on his phone, volume turned low but not low enough. A reporter stood in front of a fence lying out in the Nevada desert. The caption said Area 51 in big block letters like it was a movie trailer. Look at this, the tech muttered, thumb scrolling. Like the desert just opened up. Mara barely glanced. People were always making noise about that place. She'd learned early that the fastest way to get labeled as a problem was to look interested in the wrong things. Then her supervisor, a man named Holt who always looked slightly tired and slightly annoyed, stepped into the doorway. Mara, he said. Conference room. Now. Her stomach tightened, automatically. She followed him down the hallway, past posters about safety and silence and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior, like everyone wasn't already suspicious just by existing inside these walls. In the conference room, 2 people she didn't recognize sat with a laptop open and a folder between them. One of them wore a plain blazer. The other wore a neutral expression that didn't belong to any job Mara understood. Their badges were turned just enough that she couldn't read them. Holt closed the door behind her. Mara Reyes, the woman in the blazer said. She spoke like she was reading something she'd already memorized. We're going to need your support today. Your drone experience and your clearance level make you a good fit for the response team. Mara sat, hands folded, trying to keep them from shaking. What happened? She asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Sinkhole, the other person said, flatly. Inside the restricted perimeter. Mara almost laughed, but it didn't come out right. A sinkhole. At Area 51. The woman's eyes held steady. This isn't about the brand name people put on it. It's a facility. And there's a new hazard. We don't have the full picture yet. Mara looked down at her hands. In the quiet, she could hear her own pulse. Are people hurt? She asked. No, Holt said quickly, like he wanted that part settled. We evacuated the immediate area. No injuries reported. Relief came, then guilt for feeling relief about strangers when her own family was always on the edge. The woman slid the folder closer. We're inserting a drone to assess structure, identify risk, and determine whether there's any material that requires remediation. You'll assist with flight oversight and data capture. This is a temporary assignment. Mara nodded because nodding was easier than thinking. She signed what they put in front of her. Her pen scratched the paper like it was writing her into someone else's story. 2 hours later she was riding in a government SUV with tinted windows. Outside, the Nevada landscape rolled by in flat colors, pale sand, dull brush, distant mountains like someone had cut them out of cardboard. Her phone had no signal. The air inside the vehicle smelled like vinyl and stale coffee. Holt sat in the front seat. Mara sat in back with a tablet and a hard plastic case that held the drone. Nobody talked much. Mara tried to distract herself by thinking about normal things. Groceries. Laundry. The email she still hadn't answered from her landlord about the rent increase. The voicemail from her mom last night, the one where her mom had started cheerful and then turned quiet. I don't want to be a burden, her mom had said. I know you're tired. Mara had almost called back, but it was late, and she was tired, and she hated herself for that. By the time they reached the perimeter, the sun was high and sharp. Heat shimmered off the ground. A line of temporary barriers had been set up, and people moved with that familiar mix of calm and urgency that came from training. Clipboards. Radios. Hard hats. The kind of order that pretended it could control nature. They walked Mara to a staging area where a group stood around a hole in the ground. Mara had expected something like a crater. This was different. It looked like the desert had been cut open. The edges were jagged, chunks of earth slumped inward, and the opening was wide enough that it made Mara's throat tighten just looking at it. Dust rose and fell in lazy waves, like the ground was still settling. Somebody nearby whispered, "It's bigger than the first estimate." Mara stepped closer, careful, and felt a coldness in her chest that didn't match the heat. Not fear exactly. Something more familiar. The feeling of standing at the edge of something you couldn't fix with effort. A man in a high-vis vest pointed toward the tablet. We're sending it down. You ready? Mara swallowed. Yes. She unpacked the drone with hands that remembered the routine even when her mind didn't. Power check. Propellers. Camera feed. Stabilization. She kept her breathing steady, like she'd taught herself to do during panic attacks in college bathrooms between exams and family phone calls. When the drone lifted off, its buzz was small against the open sky. It hovered for a second, then drifted toward the opening. Mara leaned in, eyes locked on the live feed. The image shifted from bright desert glare to shadow. The drone dipped lower, and the sound in her headset changed, the air thicker down there, the signal slightly strained. The walls of the sinkhole weren't just dirt. There were layers, like time stacked on time. Broken concrete appeared in places, rebar bent like ribs. That made Mara's stomach twist. This wasn't just desert, she murmured before she could stop herself. Nobody answered her. Radios crackled. Someone cleared their throat. The drone dropped another 10 feet. And then the camera angle caught something that made Mara's hands go still. Down in the shadow, partly covered by dust, was a plain metal door set into the wall like it had always been there. Not cinematic. Not glowing. Just a real door, the kind you'd see behind a loading dock. Next to it, a faded sign with old lettering. Mara couldn't read all of it through the grit, but she caught enough. Temporary housing. Her mouth went dry. Temporary housing. Like people had lived down there. Like someone had needed to be kept out of sight. Mara stared at the screen, and her chest tightened the same way it used to when she'd sit in her car outside her mom's apartment, building courage before walking in. She thought of her mother's voice saying, "I don't want to be a burden." She thought of the word temporary, and how temporary things had a way of becoming permanent when nobody wanted to deal with them. The drone hovered, steady. Holt's voice came through her headset, lower now. "Mara, zoom in." Mara's fingers moved, but her mind was somewhere else, caught on a simple, awful idea. Sometimes the scariest thing you can find isn't something from another world. Sometimes it's proof that people made choices, and then buried them, and then acted surprised when the ground didn't hold. The drone camera tightened on the door. And in the dust beside it, half hidden, was something else. A child-sized sneaker. Sun-bleached. One lace still tied. Mara felt her throat close. She didn't know why it was there. She didn't know how old it was. She didn't know anything yet. But she knew, with a sudden clarity that made her eyes sting, that whatever they were about to uncover wasn't going to be fun. It was going to be heavy. Just like everything else in her life. And for the first time in a long time, Mara didn't know if she had enough strength left to carry it. Mara stayed at the site longer than planned, and the sun moved slowly across the desert while she sat under a shade tent staring at the paused drone feed on the tablet, and the image of the metal door stayed in her head even when she closed her eyes, and every sound around her felt louder than normal, like the world was pressing in and asking her to react when all she wanted was a moment to breathe. They shut down the drone work for the day and told everyone more teams would arrive tomorrow, and that phrase tomorrow carried a weight that followed Mara back to the parking area, and into the car where the air conditioner hummed and her phone came back to life with missed messages, and the first one was from her brother again, asking if she was okay, and she typed back that she was fine even though the word felt thin and not true. On the drive back toward Las Vegas, the desert stretched wide and empty and Mara felt small inside it, and she kept thinking about the sneaker and the sign and how temporary things sometimes stayed hidden for years because people decided not to look, and she wondered how many other things in her own life she had stepped around without facing. She stopped at a gas station on the edge of town because she needed caffeine and space and something normal, and inside the store the lights were too bright and the floor smelled like cleaner and coffee, and she stood in line holding a paper cup when the man in front of her turned around and smiled in a tired way. "Long day," he said, and his voice was calm like he was used to asking that question without expecting much back. She nodded before she could stop herself and said, "Yeah, longer than most," and that surprised her because she usually did not talk to strangers, but something about being away from the site made her guard slip. He paid for his coffee and stepped aside, but waited instead of leaving, and when Mara reached the counter he was still there stirring sugar into his cup. "You look like you saw something that stuck," he said gently, not curious, in a sharp way, just noticing. Mara felt a tightness in her chest and she almost brushed him off, but then she did not, and she said, "I work out in the desert, and today something unexpected happened," and she stopped there like that was all she could give. The man nodded like that was enough and said, "I used to work construction, and sometimes you open something up and wish you had not, but you still have to finish the job." That sentence landed deeper than she expected, and she looked at him properly then, and noticed the lines around his eyes, and the way his hands shook just a little like he carried old strain with him. They stood there quietly for a moment, and then he said, "My name is Ben, by the way," and she told him her name, and that simple exchange felt grounding, like touching something solid. They sat at a small table by the window and talked about small things, first traffic heat, the price of coffee, and then without planning it Mara found herself telling him about her mom and her brother, and the feeling of always being responsible, and Ben listened without interrupting, and that alone felt like a kindness. When she finished he said, "You sound like someone who learned early that if you do not hold everything together it might fall, and that does not mean it is your fault." Mara swallowed and looked down at her hands and said, "I know that in my head, but it does not stop the feeling." Ben smiled a little and said it never does, but sometimes sharing the weight makes it lighter, even if nothing changes right away. They left the gas station at the same time, and before parting Ben told her that he volunteered twice a week at a local community center helping people fill out forms and find resources, and he said if you ever need help with paperwork or just someone to sit with your mom for an hour you can come by. Mara thanked him and drove away feeling strange and calmer, and unsure why a short conversation could matter so much, but it did, and when she got home that night she did not collapse on the couch like usual. She called her mom instead and listened to her talk about the neighbor and the weather and the same sweater, and for once Mara did not rush the call, and when her mom said, "I am proud of you," Mara did not brush it aside. The next morning back at the site, Mara carried the conversation with her like a quiet shield, and when the drone went down again and the camera passed the metal door she felt the old heaviness but also something new, which was the sense that she was not alone with it. Later that day, a younger technician asked her a question about the data logs and she took extra time to explain and noticed how grateful he looked, and it reminded her that small care mattered even in big systems. That evening she stopped by the community center Ben had mentioned and watched people sit in plastic chairs waiting for help, and she realized how many lives existed just under the surface of daily routines unseen until someone chose to look. Mara did not know yet what the sinkhole meant or what they would uncover next, but she knew one thing clearly, which was that shutting down would not protect her or anyone else, and that connection, even brief, even imperfect, could be a form of strength. As she drove home under the city lights she felt tired but steadier, and for the first time since the desert opened up she believed that facing what was hidden did not have to be done alone. Mara returned to the site before sunrise, and the desert looked colder in the early light, and the wind moved dust across the ground in thin lines, and she sat in the vehicle for a moment before getting out because her body felt heavy, like it knew something difficult was waiting, and did not want to step forward. Inside the temporary command area people spoke in low voices and screens glowed with maps and data, and the sinkhole was quiet now, like it had finished saying what it wanted to say and was waiting for a response, and Mara took her place with the drone controls and tried to focus on routine because routine felt safe. The drone went down again and the camera moved slowly past the same layers of earth and concrete, and the metal door filled the screen once more, and Mara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, and this time she did not look away. Behind the door they found records, not secrets that changed the world, but files and notes and logs that told a simple story of people moved quietly and housed temporarily and forgotten slowly, and it was not dramatic in the way movies made things dramatic, but it was sad in a way that felt more real. Mara read through scanned pages with dates that stretched back years and words like overflow and temporary solution and review pending, and she thought about how often those words were used in normal life to delay care and responsibility. As the hours passed, the weight of it settled on her shoulders, and she found herself thinking about her own life again, about how she had postponed her own needs, and how she had told herself that later would come when things were easier. During a short break she sat alone near the edge of the site and watched the horizon, and her phone buzzed with a voicemail from her mom, and she listened to it with her headphones on. Her mom sounded confused and tired, and she asked Mara if she was coming home tonight, and when Mara did not answer right away her mom said softly, "It is okay if you are busy, I know you have important work." That sentence hit harder than any discovery in the sinkhole, and Mara felt tears rise, and she pressed her palm against her eyes and breathed slowly like she had learned years ago. She realized then that she had been living in constant delay, telling herself that she would show up fully later, that she would rest later, that she would feel later, and later had quietly turned into years. Back at the controls Holt asked if she was okay, and she said yes out of habit, and then surprised herself by saying not really, and Holt paused and nodded and said take 5, we can cover. Mara stepped outside, and the desert air felt sharp and honest, and she thought about Ben and his words about finishing the job even when it was hard, and she understood now that the job was not just about the site or the data, but about how she lived her own life. When she returned she worked with a new steadiness and documented everything carefully, and spoke up when something did not sit right, and it was uncomfortable but it also felt right. As the day stretched on, the team confirmed that the space behind the door had been unused for a long time, and that there were no current risks, and that fact brought relief but also a quiet grief for what had been allowed to fade without care. That evening Mara did not go straight home, and instead she drove to her mom's apartment and used the spare key and found her mom sitting on the couch watching a game show and wearing the same sweater, and when her mom saw her she smiled wide like the room had filled with light. They sat together and did not talk much, and Mara held her mom's hand and felt how thin it was and how strong it still felt in its own way, and she realized that being present mattered more than fixing everything. Later, when Mara lay in her childhood bed, she stared at the ceiling and thought about the sinkhole again, and how the ground had collapsed not all at once but slowly over time, and she saw the parallel clearly. Ignoring stress did not make it disappear, it only made the fall deeper when it came. The breaking point was not a single moment, but a collection of small truths lining up and asking to be seen, and Mara knew she could not go back to how she had been. She did not know what change would look like yet, and that uncertainty scared her, but it also felt honest, and she chose to sit with it instead of running from it. In the quiet of the night, she made a promise to herself that she would stop waiting for later, and start choosing now, even in small ways, and that promise felt fragile but real. As sleep finally came, Mara felt the weight still there, but it was shared now with clarity and intention, and that made all the difference. Mara woke before her alarm, and for once the feeling in her chest was not panic, but a soft awareness like something steady had taken root, and she lay still listening to the apartment sounds around her, the hum of the fridge, the distant traffic, and her mom moving slowly in the kitchen. She made breakfast and sat at the small table with her mom, and they ate in silence that felt comfortable, and when her mom smiled at her, Mara felt a small wind settle inside her because showing up had changed the morning in a way no grand solution ever could. At work the site was calmer, and the teams were wrapping up assessments and reports, and the sinkhole no longer felt like a mystery demanding fear, but like a lesson that had already spoken, and Mara completed her tasks with focus, and when Holt thanked her for her work she accepted it, instead of brushing it away. She requested a slight schedule change that afternoon, something she would have avoided before, and to her surprise it was approved without issue, and that taught her something important about how often she had assumed no without asking. Mara began stopping by the community center regularly, not to fix anything big, but to sit and help and listen, and sometimes just to be present, and Ben waved when he saw her, and they talked about ordinary things, and those ordinary moments built a sense of belonging she had not realized she was missing. At home she helped her brother set up reminders for their mom, and together they talked openly about what they could manage and what they could not, and it was not perfect, but it was honest, and honesty made the load lighter. The memory of the sinkhole stayed with Mara, but it no longer felt like a threat. Instead it became a quiet reminder that neglect grows in silence and care requires attention and courage. Weeks passed and life did not suddenly transform, but it softened at the edges, and Mara noticed small changes like sleeping better, laughing more easily, and feeling less alone in her responsibilities. One evening she stood outside under the city lights and thought about how strength was not about carrying everything alone, but about knowing when to reach out and when to rest. She understood now that resilience was built in small choices repeated daily, and that facing what was hidden inside and outside required empathy and persistence. As Mara looked ahead, she felt hopeful, not because everything was solved, but because she trusted herself to keep choosing connection over isolation and presence over delay. The story of the sinkhole would fade from the news, but its impact on her life would remain as a quiet lesson that sometimes the ground gives way to show us where care is needed most. And as she walked back inside, she carried that lesson with her, ready to share it with others who might be standing at the edge of their own unseen weight.